Why do women earn less than men? Why do people discriminate against each other? Can our taste buds really discern an expensive wine from a cheap one? Uri Gneezy and his partner John A. List sought the answers to these questions and others through numerous experiments, and they make up their book. It is called The Y-Axis: Hidden Motives and the Undiscovered Economics of Everyday Life. And joining us now to explain what incentives do motivate people to behave in certain ways and why, we welcome from San Diego, California, author Uri Gneezy. He is also a professor of economics and strategy in the Rady School of Management at the University of California, San Diego. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
We are going to spend the next half hour talking about several of the experiments that you and John List did, and behavior and economics. But I want to begin, Uri Gneezy, by asking you, when I think of economists, I think of most of them doing their work in a lab or poring over data. You and John went out into the field and did your experiments. Why did you need to do that?
Well, first of all, it's much more interesting, right? Think about the courses in economics that you took in college. They were probably extremely boring with lots of math in them. That's really important stuff, or lots of data, really important stuff, but we found it boring. So that's one good reason. We got a good excuse to go out of the lab and go to exciting places. The second is that if you want to understand, the more serious answer is that if you want to understand how people behave in the real world, you have to go to the real world and actually look at them, look what they do when they actually make decisions, when they actually choose things.
Okay, speaking of the real world, when I want to get my way, get someone to do something in the real world, I might offer them money in order to get what I want from them as an incentive. And I want to ask you about that, because I think in the modern world, that's what we think of as the easiest and best incentive. What did you learn about the effectiveness as money as an incentive?
Well, money is what we use in most cases, right? In many cases, the guy behind the camera over here is hopefully paid enough to do that, and he's happy for that, and so are you, and so am I, right? So money is not a bad motivator. In some cases, it is. So say, for example, that I go out for a weekend for a ski vacation or something like that, and I ask my secretary to stay over and work over the weekend. And then, when I come back, I give him, him or her, $10 as token of appreciation for staying over the weekend. That would be insulting, right? If I'll bring that person a box of chocolate, that would be nicer. Of course, if I'll pay that person, I'll send that person to a ski vacation too, that would be even nicer. So money could be bad, especially when it's a low amount of money. Right, so that's why we called one of our papers "Pay Enough or Don't Pay at All." Sometimes when you pay a small amount of money, you actually insult the other side. And in these cases, the amount is going to be important. In other cases, even paying would be bad. So say that I go to a friend's dinner or to my, mother-in-law dinner, for dinner, and at the end I try to pay. No matter how much I'll pay, it's going to be insulting. But again, more is better than less, but it is going to be insulting. That's not what you do. If you ask a friend to help you move a sofa, you don't pay the friend $10 at the end. You buy that friend a beer or something like that. So money has some special connotation, context that makes you feel like this is a kind of exchange. We're not friends. It's a market kind of transaction.
So do we in the Western...
That's the unique thing about money.
Do we in the Western world, given that we see money as sort of the key incentive, do we overvalue money as an incentive?
In some cases we do, absolutely. So in some cases we really see, if I'll pay you money, you'll do what I want, right? And like I said, sometimes it's insulting. Sometimes it changes the meaning of what I see that I'm doing. And that could also be bad, right? And I think I don't know if it's unique today only to the Western society, but when you go to Europe, you see less of it. So people are more, reluctant maybe to use incentives than in the US. But still, I think that over there you also use it too often.
Okay, you looked into other kinds of incentives as well. When do incentives generally not work?
So generally, they don't work when they change the meaning of the interaction. Like the example that I used with helping your friend to move a sofa. If that friend offers you pay, that friend basically tells you, look, we are not friends. We are doing some kind of exchange. I don't want to help you in the future when you'll need help, right? It changes the meaning. We call it, psychologists call it communal relationship, what you usually have with a friend, versus exchange relationship, which is what you have in the marketplace. Another example could be the signal that you send to yourself. So, for example, if you see your friend walking to the recycle center with carrying 100 cans of soda in a bag, you might feel that that person is a really good, guy. He helps the environment. That person can feel good about himself. Again, good guy helped the environment. Now imagine that you live in a place where you get 5 cents for every soda can that you recycle. And now you look at your friend doing this and you say, wow, for $5 he's willing to recycle, he's willing to do all this effort. So you change what you think about that person. And at the same time, that person could feel differently about himself. So before that, he knew that he's doing it because it was good for the environment. Now he's not sure, right? So he can't even feel good about himself because he thinks that he's doing it for $5. What connects all these, and there are many other examples that we talk about in the book, what connects them is really that the money that exchange ends changes the meaning of the interactions. Instead of being nice, I do it because I do it for the money.
Okay. In your book, you broaden this out to look at companies that experiment with different kinds of incentives. So talk to me about the example that Netflix. How would you characterize what Netflix is doing in terms of it experimenting with different kinds of incentives?
Netflix is a great example. So Netflix, just a bit of a history, it started in the late 90s as, we are the rebels. Blockbuster was the monopoly. They controlled the market. They charged lots of late fees. People didn't like them. Netflix came with a very new model, very smart one, with you choose your DVDs on the internet, you get them by mail, no late fees, really not that expensive. Then a couple of years ago, the same person who created the company had another vision. He said, look, mailing DVDs, that's history. It's going to move to streaming. So let's split the company. So overnight, instead of charging $10 for the mail and the streaming, they split it to two, $8 for mail, $8 for streaming. You had to create 2 accounts. And then they did another series of mistakes. And within a couple of months, they lost 80% of the company, $11 billion. That's a lot of money, right? And the point is that instead of doing it this way, they could have just chosen, San Diego, run a short experiment in San Diego, see how people react to it. They would have seen that people really hate it. Then, okay, it was a mistake. Let's not roll it over the nationwide, right? What's interesting is that Netflix learned its lesson. Now, if you look at the way they act, they do everything with experimentation. They had an interview with the leading people over there, including the owner. He said, look, we experiment everything. Some of them you'll know, some of them you'll never learn about because we saw that they don't work. We go to places, so say we use Ireland as our test lab. We run some stuff over there. We see what the reaction is. And then, only then we roll it over. Right? So they learned that they need to experiment. And they explicitly say that they experiment everywhere. The problem is that they paid $11 billion in tuition fee, which is quite a lot of money in order to learn this very simple rule. And the rule that we are trying to push, the principle that we are trying to push is that if you don't experiment, it's really expensive. People think that experimentation is expensive. Well, if you do it right, it could be very cheap, very fast, very easy to do. Not doing it could be much more expensive. That's what we try to convince people.
Okay, I want to talk about another issue that you raised in your book that, well, is tied to money, but is more about how representation in the workforce. And I want to talk about the gender gap. In your book, you write that despite the proportion of women in the workforce steadily increasing, only 1 in 5 senior management positions and fewer than 4% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. Uri Gneezy, how do you explain that from your research?
Right. I think it's a horrible number, right? If you think about it, this 4%, a bit below 4% for Fortune 500, that's the highest it's ever been. So that already considered a success, which is horrible, right? It's horrible from equality perspective. It's also horrible from an economic perspective because that means that very, very talented women are left outside of this, of the CEO office, and less talented men are occupying it. So that's what we see. Economists and other social scientists look at many explanations for this. One of them is simple discrimination. Women are treated less well. It's definitely over there. Another one, which Larry Summers tried to raise and got fired due to that, is some kind of ability. I don't think that we have any evidence that we can trust about ability, because they ignored the cultural issues. And there is another serious, life balance, right? Women don't want to work 70 hours a week. More men are willing to do that. So if you want to be at the CEO office, you have to spend your 20s and 30s working 70 hours a week. Then you lose the women on the way. Those are all very important explanations, I think. Another one that we try to push is competitiveness. In order to get there, you have to be extremely competitive. Whatever competition mean in the area where you are, but it could be being aggressive, risk taker, caring more about yourself than about the company. You have to be very competitive. I'm going to call it just in one, term, and I try to put it despite of the fact that it contains lots of things. And it turns out that men are much more competitive than women, right? It's not, maybe earth-shaking news to many of us that women are less competitive. You can see it from the playground, the way boys and girls are playing, and you can see it all the way to our experiments when we run them everywhere in the Western world, right? Now, the question that we try to answer is it something that, are we born differently? It's this, Darwin said, look, female needs to be less competitive because the process is such that having offspring is much more costly for women, so not women, for females. So female will have to be choosy. And for male, it's much cheaper. They want to have as many offsprings as they can, so they'll compete. So according to Darwin and the evolutionary explanation, males are going to be very competitive. Females are going to be very choosy, less competitive. So are we born differently? And if we are, then policy is not going to change that easily, right? If all these powers are over there. Or is it something that we learn? Is it cultural? So maybe because we see around us male roles and females role. We learn from the environment that boys should be competitive, girls should not. And you cannot run an experiment like this. We can't take kids, put them in different environment, and wait 20 years. That doesn't work this way. The way that we found is to go to matrilineal societies. So those are not matriarchal. Those are societies in which it's not the opposite of the most extreme patriarchal societies, but still women are much more equal in the sense that everything in the household is done by women. So only women are allowed to have real estate. Women control all the money in the household. A man lives either with his mother, his sister, or in the house of his wife. So much of the power, at least within the household, is left with the women. They handle money. They decide what kind of corpse we're going to raise next year. So they have lots of power. The village is still run by men, so it's not the opposite world completely, but it's much more egalitarian. The most egalitarian society that anthropologists could tell us that we can find. So we went to look for one. We found one in northeast India, the Kasi. And when we went there and ran the same battery of experiments that we ran everywhere else, we saw that women were just as competitive as men, actually slightly more competitive than men. And that means that it's not just that we are born differently and we can do nothing. It turns out that in the right culture, this gender gap in competitiveness disappears. So if you go to the matrilineal society, you see that women are just as competitive as men. That's, I think, very encouraging because it means that if we want to make changes in our policy and make the society more egalitarian, that's doable. Because in the right culture, when girls are raised in the right way, so more egalitarian way, they can be more competitive.
Well, let me ask you this.
So
envision a world where women were predominant. I mean, flip it on its head. Would women then discriminate against men? Would we see 4% of men as CEOs as in Fortune 500 companies?
So I'm not sure about that. I do know that, I just spoke for 5 minutes about competitiveness and how great it is that in matrilineal society, women are just as competitive as men. But who said that being more competitive is good, right? So if I want to raise my girls, do I want them to be more competitive? I'm not sure about that. Are they going to be happier by being more competitive? It's not clear. I think that one of the problems and that's the new research that we're trying to do now, one of the problems is that we're trying to change the women instead of trying to change the environment. So in many cases, the environment is more competitive than it should be, that it needs to be. And maybe instead of creating policies that will make the women more competitive, we can create some work environment that will be less competitive. Here's one example that I like. Think about the selection process. In many of the selection process to top jobs are very competitive, actually much more competitive than the job itself. So imagine that you want to have a senior writer that will work on something. You're going to put this person in a room, give all the candidates, say, an hour to write an essay and look at what they do. And that, much of it is going to be under time pressure, which is completely irrelevant in many of the professions that we have. So for a writer, if you work for a newspaper and you need to submit something within minutes, time pressure is important. If you are a fighter pilot, performing well under time pressure is important. But if you write a book, it's usually not that important. The point is that in many of the professions that we have, the selection process is much more competitive than the job itself. And it's not clear that that's the right way. So maybe instead of making people more competitive or performing better under competition, we should try and reduce the competitiveness of in this case, the selection process, to be just as competitive as the job itself, not more. That could be a much more successful policy.
All right, I want to move on to another area that you discuss widely in your book, which is discrimination. And when most people think of discrimination, we're thinking, based on someone's ethnicity or the color of their skin. But you talk about economic discrimination. So just to set the table, what is economic discrimination?
Right, so here's a great example. About a year ago, a woman enters a store in Zurich, in the Bahnhofstrasse, a bag store, and she points to a bag in the shelf behind the person behind, the salesperson, and she asks her, "Can I see this bag?" And the woman, the woman who wanted to see this was in her 50s, very well dressed. Turns out that the bag is really expensive. It's like almost $40,000. So she points to the bag, and the salesperson tells her, "You know what? No, it's too expensive. Let me show you another one." The woman insists, and she says, "No, it's too expensive. I'm not going to show you this." Turns out that the woman who wanted to buy was Oprah Winfrey. She clearly could have afforded, if anyone can afford this. Right. And she came out saying, "Look, the salesperson didn't want to show me this because I'm black." She figured out, it's not that maybe she hates blacks, but that's not the reason. She just looked at me and she said, "Oh, she's a black woman. She probably can't afford this bag." Now, there was lots of back and forth. I'm not sure about the facts anymore because there are many sides to this, but it's a great example of what we call economic discrimination. So the woman behind the counter would have been very happy to show, if she knew that it's Oprah Winfrey, she knew how much money she has, she would have probably be very happy to show her the bag and sell it. But she looked at the person and decided that that person will not be able to buy it because she's black. Now, it doesn't mean that she's not racist, but it means that she did, on top of that, she did some kind of an economic calculation. So you look at the person and you see, what's the right way to make the most money out of that person. And that's what we want to do. Now, it's interesting because, my parents were Holocaust survivors. They saw, discrimination at its worst. If you look at the US 50, 60 years ago, a black person would not be able to sit in the same part of the bus as a white person. We improved a lot in this kind of discrimination. We are not there yet. Clearly, sexual orientation is something that you can discriminate upon and many other things, but we are in a much better state than we were. I cannot go to class and say bad things about an ethnic group or gender or something like that. That would be the last thing I'll say in class. So we are much less tolerant to this kind of discrimination. However, we are moving more and more towards a kind of economic discrimination. Here's an example of an experiment we did. We sent men with disabilities in wheelchair to fix their car. So they had some body problem with the car, and they had to fix it with the van. So think about the following scenario. It's a snowy day in Chicago. You take your car, or this person takes his car to the mechanic, has to find the right parking because with the wheelchair he needs to roll out, he needs to make sure that it's the right mechanic. Then the mechanic tells him, you know what, you should wait. It will take me about an hour or two to evaluate. You can go to work, or you can wait here until I get back to you with the estimate. Now this guy, in order to go to work, he will have to find a special taxi. It's very hard to get in and out. So this guy will wait for 2 hours for the estimate, and then he'll get a price. Now imagine that, an abled person goes into the same mechanic, the same body shop with the same problem. The mechanic tells him you'll have to wait 2 hours. He says, oh, sure, I'll go to work and I'll come back in the afternoon. Now, that sounds like a very small difference. The disabled person has to invest much more effort in order to get this estimate. But from economic perspective, it means that the disabled person is much less likely to get other offers because it's really costly. He has to basically waste half a day waiting for this. And if someone is searching less for prices, you can charge that person more money because he's not going to get competitive offers. And unfortunately, that's what we saw. We saw that disabled people got 30% higher quotes to fix their car than able people who went with the same car to different mechanics, of course, right? So that was really, I think it's a great example or a very bad example of economic discrimination. We don't think that the mechanic discriminated because they don't like disabled people. They discriminated because they can, because of the economic environment.
Right, and just to point out, none of this stuff is done sort of conscientiously and deliberately. This is stuff that's going on in our heads that sometimes we don't even recognize.
In many cases, I'm sure that it's not conscious, right? So you don't even know that you're doing this, right? So you don't even know. Look, when we see a person, we immediately notice the gender of the person, the age of the person, whether they're attractive to us or not. We notice lots of things, whether we like it or not. I know that the person behind the camera over here is a man. I know that I know many things about that person without consciously thinking about that. And I behave accordingly. But going back to the mechanic, what was nice is that when the disabled people went to the body shop and said what we call the 7 word, I hope I got the 7 words correctly, but that's the 7 words fix. Basically, they said, I'm getting 3 quotes today, right? 3 estimates today. I am, well, whatever, if it's 7 words, right? What's nice about this is that it fixes the problem, right? Once you signal to the mechanic, look, I'm getting 3 quotes today, that fixes the problem. Because now the mechanic knows that, well, I can't get a home run with you. Again, whether conscious or not, I don't know, but he knows that this guy is going to search, and if this guy is going to search, he needs to be competitive with him. And that's true in many other domains. Now, this kind of economic discrimination happens much more than it used to. Think about all the big data. Think about, next time you book a flight somewhere. So I'm a United person. I try to fly with United. They know everything about my pattern. They know, for example, that I flew to Australia and I flew business a couple of months ago. That means that I have maybe money to waste. So they're going to offer me maybe a more expensive ticket, a more expensive class when I book my flight. And companies are using this data all the time. They know which zip code we are logging in from. They know lots of stuff about us, and they're trying to use it. Some of it is good, some of it is bad. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not in the business of ethics. I think that we agreed that discriminating against disabled people is bad. I'm not sure if we agreed that discriminating against people who can buy more expensive tickets is bad, but we should be aware of it. Once we are aware of it, we can find ways like the 7 words fix that I discussed that will reduce at least the amount of discrimination that we suffer from.
Uri Gneezy, I appreciate your time. Thank you for your advice and your insights. And your book is a wonderful read. Lots of interesting experiments. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.